The morning Thomas Bancroft found the woman unconscious in his creek bed, her traveling dress soaked through and her dark hair tangled with creek grass. He stood over her for a full 3 minutes before he did anything at all, because in 11 years of living on this land alone, nothing had ever arrived unannounced and still been breathing. The year was 1873, and the land Thomas called his own sat in the wide belly of southeastern Colorado Territory, where the Arkansas River fed smaller veins of water through red-brown earth, and the Sangre de Cristo Mountains rose like a purple promise on the western edge of every sunrise. He had claimed the parcel in 1862, when he was 22 years old and the government was selling land to anyone willing to scratch a life from it. He had scratched harder than most. 320 acres, a stone and timber house he had built board by board, a barn that had survived 2 winters of killing cold, a modest cattle herd, and a garden that produced more than he could ever eat alone. That last detail had always struck him as a waste, but he had never changed it. He kept planting more than he needed, because it was the one extravagance the land allowed him, the one small rebellion against the austerity he had otherwise made into a religion. He knelt beside her and pressed 2 fingers to her neck the way his father had once taught him when teaching him to check a downed animal. Her pulse was there, steady and faintly stubborn. She was alive. Her lips were parted and her face was pale beneath what had once been a flush of color. She was young, he thought. Maybe 25, maybe 26. She wore a traveling coat over a muslin dress, and there was a carpetbag 6 feet upstream, snagged on a willow root and half submerged. He looked at the bag and then at her and then at the mountains, and for one wild moment he considered the possibility that the land was testing him. He lifted her. She was lighter than he expected. He carried her up the creek bank, through the cottonwood grove, across the yard, and into the house where he laid her on the rope bed in his spare room that had never once been used for a guest. He built a fire in the small iron stove in the corner, because the September morning had a chill that would deepen with afternoon cloud cover, and then he went back to fetch the carpetbag from the creek. She woke up 2 hours later while he was sitting in the ladderback chair by the window reading a 3-month-old newspaper from Pueblo, which was the only kind of newspaper he ever got because the supply rider from town came infrequently and cared nothing for current events. Thomas heard the small, sharp intake of breath that meant someone had just remembered where they weren't, and he folded the paper in his lap and looked at the doorway and waited. She appeared in the doorway wrapped in the quilt he had left at the foot of the bed. Her hair was still damp. Her eyes were dark brown and very wide, and she was looking at him the way a person looks at something they haven't yet decided is a threat. "You're in my house," he said, because it seemed the most neutral thing to say. "I know that," she said. "I don't know how I got here. I found you in my creek. You'd hit your head on something. There's a cut above your ear." Her hand went to her head automatically and she winced. "How long have I been here?" 2 hours, maybe a little more." She looked around the room with those careful dark eyes, taking inventory the way a practical person does. She was noting exits, he realized. She was noting the distance between herself and the door. He had seen that kind of assessment before in people who had learned caution the hard way. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. "Men who intend harm rarely announce themselves," she said. "That's fair," he said, "but I'm not going to hurt you." Something in his voice, or perhaps something in the plainness of the house around him, the complete absence of anything theatrical or dangerous, seemed to satisfy her in a provisional way. She moved from the doorway to the wooden chair at the small table by the window and sat down with the quilt still wrapped around her shoulders. "My name is Lydia Hayes," she said. "I was traveling from Pueblo to a ranch near a town called Hartwell. The wagon I hired broke an axle crossing a dry creek bed about 3 miles back, and the driver said he couldn't make the repair until morning, and I thought I could walk the remaining distance. But I must have gotten turned around and then the creek." She stopped. "I fell in the creek." "You did," Thomas said. "What ranch near Hartwell?" "The Alderman Ranch. I have a letter from a Mr. Josiah Alderman offering me a teaching position for the children of his household and 2 neighboring families. Thomas was quiet for a moment. He knew Josiah Alderman. Josiah Alderman was a large, red-faced man who had made a considerable fortune in cattle and had a habit of treating people who worked for him as furniture that occasionally required reprimand. He had 3 children who were, by all accounts, undisciplined in the particular way of children who had never been told no by anyone with authority. The position Alderman had advertised, Thomas now recalled hearing about in passing from the supply rider, had apparently gone unfilled for 2 months because 2 previous teachers had quit within their first weeks. "You're the 3rd one," Thomas said. Lydia Hayes looked at him. "I beg your pardon. The 3rd teacher Alderman's hired. The other 2 left." "I know," she said, and her chin went up in a way that was not defiant so much as determined. "I spoke with the 2nd one in Pueblo before I left. She told me the conditions were difficult and the children were challenging. She was not wrong to leave. I am choosing to stay. You haven't arrived yet." "I will arrive," she said, "as soon as I can recover my bearings and my bag and arrange to continue to Hartwell." "The Alderman Ranch is another 4 miles from Hartwell," he said, "and Hartwell is 8 miles from here, and the sky is going to open up this afternoon." She looked at the window. The light had indeed taken on that greenish, pressurized quality that meant serious weather was forming. She had not noticed it before. She noticed it now, and her face went through a very quick and readable sequence of calculations. "The driver won't be able to fix the axle in this weather," she said. "No, and I cannot walk 12 miles in a storm." "No," she looked at him. He looked at her. The fire in the stove made a small, domestic sound. "I can pay you for a room," she said. "I have money." "Keep your money," he said. "The room is there. You already used it." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That is very kind of you." He picked up his newspaper again. "It's practical. I'm not going to carry you out of a creek and then put you in the rain." She almost smiled. He saw the edge of it before she suppressed it. She pulled the quilt tighter and looked out the window at the darkening sky. The storm that came that afternoon was the kind that Colorado Territory produced in early autumn as a reminder that the season's softness was borrowed time. It arrived like a wall of dark blue pushed ahead of a wind that bent the cottonwoods to an angle they were not meant to hold, and then the rain came in earnest, cold, and determined, drumming on the roof and running in rivers off the eaves. Thomas was not a man who minded storms. He had weathered 11 years of them alone in this house, and they had never troubled him. He went about his afternoon the way he always did, checking on the cattle in the lower pasture, securing the barn, feeding the 2 horses and the small flock of chickens that lived in the linta behind the house. By the time he came back inside, drenched and smelling of wet wool and hay, Lydia Hayes had, in the 2 hours he had been outside, cleaned his kitchen. He stood in the doorway and looked at the kitchen and then at her. She was standing at the stove stirring something in his largest pot, and she was wearing a dry dress from her carpetbag, a simpler one in gray-blue cotton that suited her better than the traveling coat. She had also, apparently, located his coffee because there was a pot of it on the back of the stove and the whole room smelled of it. "I found salt pork and dried beans," she said without turning around. "I hope you don't mind." "I don't mind," he said. "I needed something to do," she said. "I don't manage idleness well." He hung his coat on the peg by the door and went to the wash basin and cleaned his hands and face. "How's your head?" "Better. The headache is mostly gone." He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood at the opposite end of the kitchen and looked at his cleaned counters and shelves and felt something strange and unnameable move through him. Not discomfort, not irritation. Something more like bewilderment, the way you feel when a piece of furniture you have looked at every day for years is moved 6 inches to the left and the whole room looks different. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "But the beans needed soaking and the salt pork was sitting out and your shelves were a little confused." She said this last part as if it were a very gentle medical diagnosis. "Confused," he repeated. "The coffee was next to the axle grease." "The axle grease was in a tin." It was still next to the coffee. He looked at the shelf where his coffee had previously lived. She had moved the coffee to a higher shelf, and the axle grease had presumably been removed to the barn or the back porch where, he conceded internally, it probably belonged. "I've lived alone a long time," he said. "I can see that," she said. There was no judgment in it, just observation. She turned and looked at him fully for the first time in good light, and he was struck again by those dark, direct eyes and the particular set of her face, which was the face of a person who had learned to take in information quickly and trust her own reading of it. "Thomas Bancroft," he said, because he had not yet told her his name. "Lydia Hayes," she said, though she had told him that already. "I know," he said. "Right," she said. "You do." She turned back to the stove. They ate supper at the small table by the window while the storm shook the house, and the lamplight held them in its warm and narrow circle. She told him she was from St. Louis originally, that her father had been a school teacher and her mother a seamstress, that she had trained to teach, and had taught for 3 years at a school in Pueblo, before the school's funding dried up because the funding for schools in growing western towns in 1873 dried up constantly. A fact that was one of the more dependable cruelties of territorial life. She had answered Alderman's advertisement because she needed work, and because she had a streak of stubbornness about her that made other people's failures seem less like warnings and more like challenges. He listened. He was not, by nature, a man who talked much. 11 years alone had made him economical with words in the way that solitude always does. But he found that listening to her was easy in a way he had not expected, because she spoke with precision and wit, and she did not fill silence with noise, only with things worth saying. When she stopped talking and ate her beans, he did not feel compelled to fill the space she had left. She asked him after a while how long he had been on this land. 11 years, he said, since 62. Alone the whole time. Mostly, there was a hired hand for 2 years in the late 60s. He moved on to a bigger operation north of here. Don't you get lonely? He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. I thought I didn't, he said. She looked at him. And now? I'm still thinking about it, he said. She looked down at her bowl, and there was that edge of a smile again, and this time it came a little further before she pulled it back. The storm hammered the roof, and the lamp flame bent slightly in a draft from the window, and outside the cottonwoods were being thoroughly rearranged by the wind. He woke at 4 in the morning to silence. The storm had broken. He lay in his bed in the dark and listened to the new quiet of the land after rain, which was a different kind of quiet than the usual kind, thicker and more satisfied, the quiet of something that had said its piece and gone to sleep. He had always found that quiet peaceful. He lay in it now and found that it was different tonight, and it took him several long minutes lying with his eyes open in the dark to understand why. It was different because it was not the only quiet in the house. There was a second quiet, the quiet of another person sleeping in the next room, and that quiet was not peaceful in the same way the land's quiet was peaceful. It was a quiet with a pulse in it. It was a quiet that changed the air. He got up before dawn the way he always did and went about the morning work. He fed the animals and checked the pasture fence for storm damage and started the stove and made coffee. And by the time the sun came up orange and clean-washed over the flat eastern horizon, he had been awake 2 hours and he had thought about Lydia Hayes for most of them, which was a fact he acknowledged to himself with the same plain directness he tried to apply to everything and then set aside, because she was passing through and the road to Hartwell would be passable by mid-morning, and that was the shape of things. She came out of the spare room at 6:30 wearing the gray-blue dress and her hair pinned up at the back of her neck, and she accepted the coffee he offered her and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the washed world. "It's beautiful," she said, "all that wet red earth." "Yes," he said, "you must love it here." "I do," he said. And then, because the statement seemed to require something more, he said, "I came here when I was 22. I had $60 and a mule and a letter from the land office. I thought I was making a practical decision. I didn't know it would become." He stopped. "Become what?" she asked, looking at him. "Home," he said. "The kind that's inside you." Not just a place you live. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, I've never had that, a place that felt like that. No, St. Louis was where I was born. Pueblo was where I worked. Neither of them was mine in that way. Maybe you haven't found yours yet, he said. She looked out at the mountains, which were very clear in the rain-washed morning air and very purple and very large. Maybe, she said. They ate breakfast together, and he drove her in his wagon as far as the dry creek bed where her hired driver had been stranded. And they found the driver, a weathered old man named Stokes, still there and working on the axle with the considerable irritation of a man who has been rained on all night and is running out of patience with the world. Lydia Hayes thanked Thomas with a seriousness that made him feel that she understood the full weight of what she was thanking him for, and she climbed up onto the repaired wagon seat and Stokes flicked the reins, and the wagon moved east toward Hartwell and she did not look back, and Thomas drove back to his land and stood in the yard for a moment and listened to the silence that had rushed back in like water filling a shape. He called it peace. He went about his day. He had been on his land 11 years, and in 11 years, he had built something solid and good and entirely his own. He knew the character of every acre of it, the particular way the south pasture held water in spring, the one dry spot near the north fence where nothing would grow no matter what he planted, the creek that ran clear in summer and ice-colored in winter, the way the mountains changed color through the day from purple to gray to pink to gold. He knew the rhythm of the seasons here the way you know the rhythms of a language you have spoken long enough to dream in, and he had found a deep and genuine satisfaction in that knowledge. But the day after Lydia Hayes rode away in Stokes's repaired wagon, he stood in his own kitchen, and the kitchen felt differently sized. Not smaller. Just differently shaped, like a room whose furniture has been rearranged in the night and your eyes keep going to where things used to be. He told himself this was simply the disruption of having had someone in the house. He had been alone for so long that any presence would have left a residue. He told himself this was natural and temporary, and by Thursday it would be gone. By Thursday it was not gone. By Thursday he had found himself thinking about the precise way she had said I'm choosing to stay, about the edge of that suppressed smile, about the way she had stood at his window and looked at the mountains with the expression of someone recognizing something they hadn't known they were looking for. He rode into Hartwell on Friday under the excuse of picking up supply goods that were not urgently needed. Hartwell in 1873 was a small and aspirational town, the kind that kept getting buildings added to it faster than the buildings could develop character. There was a general store, a feed and grain, a saloon, a small post office, a blacksmith, a church of uncertain denomination that served 3 denominations in rotation, and a doctor who was also the barber and who treated both conditions with equal seriousness. Thomas knew most of the people in Hartwell by name if not by inclination, and when he tied his horse at the post office rail, he was stopped almost immediately by Cora Tanner, who ran the general store with her husband and who was the primary engine of information distribution in the county. Thomas Bancroft, Cora said, with the tone of someone who has been saving a piece of news. You heard about the new teacher Alderman brought in. Woman from Pueblo named Hayes. I heard something about it, he said. Well, she's causing quite a stir over at the Alderman place. Josiah Alderman is not pleased with her, and she has been at his ranch less than a week. What kind of stir? Cora Tanner folded her hands on her apron with the pleasure of someone who keeps a full pantry. She told him the children need structure and consistent discipline, and that she won't teach in a room that doesn't have proper light and ventilation. Alderman apparently told her she'd teach where she was told, and she apparently told him that good conditions for learning are not negotiable if he wants good outcomes for his children. And when Alderman reminded her that she was an employee, she apparently reminded him that an employee is not a piece of furniture. Cora paused for effect. Josiah Alderman is not accustomed to being spoken to that way by anyone, let alone a woman from Pueblo. No, Thomas said. He's not. I think she may be gone inside a month, Cora said. Like the others. "I don't think she'll go," Thomas said, and surprised himself with the certainty in his voice. Cora Tanner gave him a long and speculative look that he recognized as the precursor to a conclusion he was not prepared to have drawn. "How would you know that?" she asked. "I met her," he said, "when she was passing through." "Did you?" said Cora. "I need salt and lamp oil," he said, and went into the store. He did not go to the Alderman Ranch. He had no reason to go to the Alderman Ranch. He bought his salt and his lamp oil and a small sack of cornmeal, and he rode home and did his evening work and ate his supper alone and went to bed. 2 weeks later, Lydia Hayes arrived at his gate on a borrowed horse. He was mending the south pasture fence when he saw her coming down the track from the road, and he stood with a fence post in one hand and a hammer in the other and watched her come. She was riding with the practical uprightness of a woman who has learned to ride in the West rather than been born to it, her back straight and her face serious under the brim of a brown hat that was too large for her and was clearly not hers. She stopped at the gate and looked at him across it. "Mr. Bancroft," she said. "Miss Hayes," he said. "I need your advice," she said, "if you have time." He set down the fence post and the hammer. "I have time." She dismounted and tied the horse to the gate post with a knot that was competent if not elegant, and walked toward him through the long grass of the pasture edge. She was wearing a dark coat over a white blouse, and she looked tired in the way of people who have been fighting something for 2 weeks, not broken but worn at the edges. "Tell me about Josiah Alderman," she said. "Everything you know." He told her. He told her that Alderman was a man who had built his ranch through force of will and considerable ruthlessness in the early days, and had developed the conviction that this made him correct by default. He told her that Alderman's wife, Clara, had died 4 years ago, and that her death had left the 3 children, whose names were Emmett, Pearl, and little George, in the care of a succession of underpaid and underappreciated household workers who had neither the authority nor the inclination to provide structure. He told her that Alderman valued appearances more than substance, that his greatest fear was being thought less of by the men of standing in the county, and that his relationship with his children was one of formal distance punctuated by occasional and unpredictable warmth. "So the children act out," she said, "because they have been given no consistent expectations and no secure affection. That's my reading," he said, "and Alderman objects to my conditions because he interprets them as a challenge to his authority rather than a practical necessity." "Yes. So I need to frame my requirements as being in service of his reputation rather than in conflict with his preferences." "That would probably work better," he said. She was quiet for a moment, thinking. A red-tailed hawk was riding a thermal over the south pasture, and they both watched it for a moment without meaning to. "You're good at reading people," she said. "I read them from a distance," he said. "I don't have many close ones to practice on." She looked at him. "Is that by choice?" "By habit," he said, "which is not always the same thing." She looked at him for another moment with those dark, steady eyes, and then she looked back at the hawk and said, "I'm going to stay. I want you to know that, whatever Alderman does." "I know," he said. "You keep saying that," she said, and this time the smile came all the way out. It was a good smile, full and genuine and slightly surprised by itself, as if it had come out further than she intended, and it hit Thomas Bancroft somewhere in the chest with the particular precision of something that has been aimed very well. She stayed for an hour. They walked the fence line together because he had to finish the mending, and she seemed unbothered by the work happening alongside the conversation. And they talked about teaching and about the land, and about St. Louis, and about the way Colorado Territory in 1873 was a place where everything was being invented at the same time as everything was going wrong, where the land was being settled at a rate and by methods that were tearing up things older and more rooted than anyone in Washington seemed to understand or care about. "The Ute people have been here for centuries," she said, at one point, "and the government keeps pushing the boundary of their reservation further west. I heard in Pueblo that there's a new push to move them again, further from their traditional lands. It's been happening as long as I've been here, Thomas said. He drove a fence post with a clean economy of motion. And before? What happened to the Cheyenne and Arapaho at Sand Creek, not 40 miles from here, 9 years ago? That was a massacre of people who were peaceable and encamped under the protection of a treaty. The men responsible faced no real consequence. He stopped. It's an injustice that doesn't end and doesn't get named properly. No, she said. It doesn't. She was quiet for a moment. I think about the children I'll be teaching, what version of this history they'll learn. Whether anyone will teach them the true shape of it. Will you? I'll try, she said, which is probably another thing aldermen won't approve of. Probably not, he said. She left in the late afternoon on the borrowed horse, riding east toward the Alderman Ranch with her back straight and her too large hat and the particular determined set of her shoulders. Thomas watched her go and then went back to the fence and finished the mending and then stood in the yard as the sun went down, and the mountains went red and gold and finally purple, and the land settled into its evening quiet. And for the first time in 11 years, the quiet felt like something with an edge to it. Over the following weeks she came back 3 more times. Each time she brought something, a question about the land, a problem at the Alderman Ranch that she wanted a second perspective on, once a book she had found in the Alderman household's meager library that she thought he might want to read. He read it. He returned it with a note tucked inside the cover that said he had agreed with the first half and disagreed with the second half, and she had sent it back with a note that disagreed with his disagreement, and they had argued about it the next time she came, standing in his kitchen with coffee cooling in their cups. And it was the best argument Thomas Bancroft had had in 11 years, because it was with someone whose mind worked as fast as her tongue, and who did not yield a position she believed in simply because the other person was larger or louder. He looked forward to her visits with a kind of quiet, fierce intensity that he did not entirely examine because examining it would require him to name it, and he was not yet ready for that. She, in the meantime, had transformed the situation at the Alderman Ranch through a combination of strategic patience and what Cora Tanner described, with considerable admiration, as sheer willful nerve. She had gotten aldermen to agree to a proper schoolroom in the old dining room of the ranch house, by framing it as the kind of arrangement that the better Eastern families provided for their children. And Josiah Alderman, whose awareness of what the better Eastern families did was both extensive and aspirational, had agreed before he fully understood what he was agreeing to. The 3 children, Emmett, who was 9, Pearl, who was 7, and little George, who was 5, had responded to Lydia's combination of genuine warmth and absolute consistency, the way starved things respond to regular feeding, with initial wariness that gradually gave way to something approaching devotion. She told Thomas about the children on her 4th visit, in October, sitting on the split-log bench on his front porch while the afternoon light went amber over the pastures. "Emmett is brilliant," she said. "He's been told he's difficult so many times that he's decided to live up to it. Pearl reads already, better than most children twice her age. And George—" her face changed in the way faces change when someone is about to say something genuinely tender. "George carries a small stone in his pocket that he told me was magic. He showed it to me yesterday and explained that it protects the people he cares about. He put it in my hand for a moment so it would know me." Thomas watched her face while she talked about George's stone and felt something shift in him the way ice shifts at the beginning of a thaw, slowly and then all at once. "What?" she said, noticing him watching her. "Nothing," he said. "I was just thinking that those children are lucky." "I'm the lucky one," she said. "I needed them as much as they needed me." "That's a generous way to see it." "It's an honest way to see it," she said. She looked out at the pasture where his small cattle herd was grazing in the gold afternoon light. "I haven't had anyone to take care of in a long time," she said. "Not since my mother got sick," and then she stopped. "When did she die?" he asked quietly. 2 years ago. My father had been gone 4 years before that, So it's been 2 years of just me. She said it plainly without self-pity, but he heard the weight in it that she wasn't giving to her voice. I know something about that, he said. She looked at him. Yes, she said. I imagine you do. The afternoon lay around them in its gold and unhurried way. A horse in the pasture lifted its head and then went back to grazing. The bench was not large, and they were sitting close enough that he could feel the warmth coming off her. He was aware of it with every part of him that was capable of awareness. Thomas, she said. Yes. Why do you live alone? He thought about it carefully, the way he tried to think about everything that deserved careful thought. It started as circumstance, he said, and then it became easy, or what I thought was easy. The absence of something can be easy to mistake for peace if you've had it long enough. She turned and looked at him fully, and there was something in her eyes that was not quite a question and not quite an answer, but something between, something provisional and searching. When I came here, she said slowly, everything was broken. My wagon was broken, my head was bleeding. I had nothing but a carpetbag and an argument to have with a man who didn't want to listen. And you carried me in without being asked. You didn't make a production of it, you just did it. It was the practical thing to do, he said. Thomas, she said with a note in her voice that meant stop hiding behind practicality. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I've thought about you every day since you rode away in Stokes's wagon. She didn't look away. I know, she said. I've thought about you too. The afternoon held its breath. I don't know what to do with that, he said. I haven't. You haven't done this in a long time, she said. Neither have I. I don't want to be someone who asks for something and can't hold it. I don't think that's who you are, she said. You've known me 6 weeks. I know, she said. I know it's 6 weeks, and I know I'm living on another man's ranch, and I know that this is, she looked at her hands for a moment. I know that it's quick. I know that it probably looks foolish from the outside. She looked up at him. But I came to this land with nothing, and I found you. Not just the house and the warmth, but you, and I don't think I'm mistaken about what I found. Thomas Bancroft looked at Lydia Hayes in the amber October light of his front porch, with the cattle grazing in the field behind her, and the mountains going gold on the horizon, and he thought about 11 years of solitude that he had called peace and understood, with the sudden and complete clarity of something that has been true for a long time and has only just been seen, that he had been calling it the wrong name. I would like to court you properly, he said, if you'd allow it. She looked at him with those dark eyes and that smile that had been surprising itself since the first time it appeared. I would allow that, she said. What followed was a courtship conducted in the particular key of two people who are both too honest and too impatient for games, and therefore move through the conventional stages at a pace that would have scandalized St. Louis and merely raised an eyebrow in Colorado territory, where the conventions had always been more loosely held because the land had never waited for anyone to finish observing them. He came to the Alderman Ranch on Sunday afternoons. She came to his place on Wednesdays when she had a half day. They rode the land together, and he showed her things about it that he had never shown anyone. The place where the creek bent, and in early morning you could see 3 different species of hawk in the same sky. The rock shelf on the rise above the north pasture, where you could see 40 miles in every direction on a clear day. The place where the soil changed color in a perfectly straight line, red on one side and dark brown on the other, for reasons that he had never fully been able to explain, but had always found beautiful. She listened to all of it with genuine interest, not the polite interest of someone being patient, but the real interest of someone for whom the world is a series of questions that each deserve proper attention. She asked him about the soil change, and he told her he had once asked a Ute elder he had traded with, a man named Severo, who occasionally came through the territory on traditional routes, and Severo had told him the land remembered things that men had forgotten, and Thomas had thought that was probably the best answer he was going to get. Did you trade with him often? She asked. A few times, he said. He was a good man. He hasn't come through in 2 years. The restriction of movement on his people has gotten worse. He said it with the flat sadness of someone who has watched an injustice continue without the means to stop it. There's nothing glorious about what's been done to this land's first people in the name of settlement. I try to remember that. I try not to let the fact that I benefit from it make me comfortable with it. She was looking at him with an expression he was beginning to recognize, a kind of quiet satisfaction, as if something she had suspected was being confirmed. "You're not what I expected when I woke up in your spare room," she said. "What did you expect?" "I didn't know what I expected." "A rough man with a rough life, probably, practical and limited. I'm sorry, that sounds unkind." "It sounds honest," he said, "and it's fair. I've had a rough life and I've made it practical on purpose." "But not limited," she said. "I've tried not to be," he said. "The land doesn't limit you if you pay attention to it right." She looked out from the rock shelf at the 40 miles of open country spread before them, mountains to the west, plains to the east, the thin silver line of the Arkansas visible in the far distance, the sky going its enormous Colorado blue overhead. "I think I understand why you stayed," she said. "I think I understand why this became the inside kind of home." He looked at her profile against that enormous sky and thought that if the land could be described as lonely before she came, which he was now willing to admit it had been, then this was what the opposite of that felt like. Not crowded, not diminished, the opposite, everything larger, everything with more color in it. "Lydia," he said. She turned. He kissed her. She kissed him back. The wind moved through the grass on the rock shelf, and the hawks rode the thermals below them, and the mountains stood in their enormous permanence on the western horizon, and neither of them was in any particular hurry to be anywhere else. November came in cold and blue, and with it a complication that Thomas had half expected and Lydia had fully prepared for. Josiah Alderman, who had been watching the Sunday afternoon visits with increasing calculation, called Lydia into his study one evening after supper and told her that her arrangement with his household made a courtship difficult and potentially inappropriate, by which he meant, though he did not say it directly, that he was not certain it was proper for his children's teacher to be conducting a romantic association while living under his roof, and he was also not certain, given that he had said this, whether the romantic association or the position would have to be the thing that ended. Lydia had reported this conversation to Thomas the following Wednesday with the calm of someone who has already considered all possible responses and chosen the one that is both principled and strategically sound. "I told him that my personal associations outside of working hours are my own concern and not subject to his approval," she said, "and that if he intended to make them a condition of my employment, then I would need him to state that in writing so that we could discuss it with the other families who share the cost of my wages, particularly the Calloway family and the Marsh family, who I think would not support the position he was taking." "What did he say to that?" Thomas asked. "He said he was merely raising the matter as a concerned employer," she said, "and I said I appreciated his concern and considered the matter closed." Thomas looked at her across his kitchen table and felt something rise in him that was pride and admiration in equal measure, and something else underneath both of them that was simply the overwhelming fact of her. "You know he's not going to let this go," he said. "I know," she said, "which is why I'd like to talk to you about something." He waited. "The Calloway family," she said. "They have 4 children and they live 3 miles south of here, and they mentioned that they have a spare room in their house that they would rent very reasonably to a teacher if the teacher needed somewhere else to live. Mrs. Calloway told me this last week, and I think she was making the offer as a genuine one." "You've been planning this," he said. "I've been preparing," she said. "There's a difference. Planning implies I was certain of the outcome. Preparing implies I understood the possibilities." "Are the Calloways good people?" "Yes," she said. "Margaret Calloway is excellent, her husband is quiet and decent, their children are wonderful. And they understand that a teacher needs some independence to do the work well. If you moved to the Calloway place," he said carefully, "you'd be 3 miles south of here." "Yes," she said, "that's closer than the Alderman Ranch." "Considerably," she said. He looked at his hands on the table for a moment and then looked at her. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. I want to ask you something that I want you to give a real answer to and not a polite one, he said. Because I'm not good at this and I'd rather ask plainly and be refused plainly than talk around something important. She was very still. Ask me, she said. I've lived on this land 11 years, he said. I've built something here. It's not grand, but it's solid and it's mine, and I believe there's room for more than one person in it if the other person wanted to be here. I've thought about little else for 2 months. He stopped. I know it's fast. I know the right way to do this would be another few months of Sunday afternoons and Wednesday rides. But I'm 33 years old and I have been alone on this land for 11 years, and when you leave on Wednesdays, the silence is different than it used to be. It used to be peaceful. Now he stopped again. Empty, she said quietly. Yes, he said. I'm asking you to marry me, Lydia. I know that's sudden. I know you've only been in this territory. Yes, she said. He stopped. Yes, what? Yes, I'll marry you, she said. Her voice was steady and certain, and her eyes were very bright. I know it's fast. I know it probably should be another few months of Sunday afternoons. But I've been alone for 2 years, and I came to this territory with nothing, and I found you, and I know what I found. She took a breath. And I know that this land is yours, and I'm not asking to take it from you. I'm asking to be part of it, if you'll have me that way. He reached across the table and took her hand. Her fingers closed around his immediately, firmly, with no hesitation. I'll have you that way, he said. They were married in December of 1873 at the Hartwell Church, on a Tuesday afternoon when the sky was white and cold, and the mountains were wearing their winter snow. The church was attended by Cora and Bill Tanner from the general store, by Margaret and Frank Calloway and their 4 children, by the Marsh family from 4 miles east, by old Stokes the wagon driver who had somehow heard and appeared at the back of the church smelling of horses and wearing a clean shirt, and by Emmett, Pearl, and little George Alderman, who had asked their father if they could attend and who had each brought something. Emmett had brought a small carved wooden figure he had made himself that he pressed into Thomas's hand at the door. Pearl had brought a bunch of dried wildflowers from the ranch's summer garden, which she presented to Lydia with considerable solemnity. George had brought his magic stone, which he placed temporarily in Lydia's coat pocket during the ceremony and then took back afterward, explaining that it had now transferred its protection to both of them and needed to be recharged. Even Josiah Alderman came. He came late and stood at the back and left immediately after the ceremony without speaking to anyone, but he came. Thomas thought this was probably as close as Alderman could get to acknowledging that he had been wrong, and decided to accept it as that. The minister, a traveling reverend named Partridge who covered 3 counties and always seemed faintly surprised to find himself in any of them, conducted the ceremony with brisk warmth and pronounced them man and wife with what felt like personal satisfaction. Thomas kissed his wife in front of the whole church, and she kissed him back in the same completely committed way she had kissed him on the rock shelf in October, with the same warmth and the same fullness. And Cora Tanner said afterward that it was the best wedding she had been to in 6 years, and she had been to 11. They rode home together in the wagon through the cold December air, Lydia's shoulder against his, the horse's breath steaming in the white afternoon, the Sangre de Cristo Mountains standing to the west in their winter white. "Are you cold?" he asked. "No," she said. "I'm not cold at all." He pulled her closer. She leaned into him. The wheels of the wagon made clean tracks in the thin dusting of snow on the road, and the land around them was very still and very white and very much itself. They pulled into the yard, and the house looked different to Thomas than it had ever looked before. It looked lived in. It looked complete. He had built it board by board when he was 22 years old, and it had been his in all the ways that matter, and yet looking at it now, he understood that there had been something it was waiting for that it had only just received. He helped her down from the wagon, and she stood in the yard and looked at the house and then looked at him. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. "I'm thinking it's mine," she said. "It's the first time something has been mine. The inside way." He took her face in both his hands and looked at her in the white winter light for a long moment and then kissed her again in the yard, with the snow beginning to come down lightly, with the horses standing patient at the fence and the mountains holding their silence to the west. "Welcome home," he said. "Home," she said, trying it out, nodding at it. "Yes, that's exactly right." The winter of 1873 into 1874 was a hard one. The kind of Colorado winter that tests whether what you have built was built for keeping or only for looking at. The snow came deep in January, and the cold that followed was merciless, dropping temperatures to lows that killed 2 of Thomas's cattle and froze the creek for 3 weeks solid. Thomas worked the land in the way he always had through hard winters, methodically and without complaint, and Lydia worked alongside him with a competence that surprised him initially, and then stopped surprising him, because he began to understand that she had never been the kind of person who considered herself exempt from hard work, only from unfair treatment, and the distinction was one she held with great precision. She learned to split wood in January, insisting on it despite his initial objection, and by February she was better at it than his former hired hand had been. She learned the cattle, which ones were good-natured and which needed watching, the particular one he called Rojo, who had a tendency to find gaps in fences and exploit them, the 2 gentle old cows who were past calving but who he kept anyway because getting rid of them had never seemed right. She continued teaching. She rode to the Callaway place, where the schoolroom had been established for the 4 Callaway children, and 3 days a week other children arrived, the Marsh children, the Alderman 3, 2 children from a family called Dowsett who had recently settled 6 miles east. She was, by all accounts, exceptional. Margaret Callaway told Thomas once with considerable feeling that her eldest son, who had been convinced since birth that reading was an activity designed specifically to torment him, had recently been found in the barn at 9 o'clock at night, with a lamp reading a history book that Lydia had given him. Even Josiah Alderman, who had continued to be a difficult man in all the ways he had always been difficult, came to Thomas in February to say, with the stiffness of someone swallowing something that doesn't go down easy, that Miss Hayes, he still called her Miss Hayes, was a fine teacher, and that his children had changed significantly for the better, and he hoped any friction between them had been left behind. Thomas said it had been left behind. Alderman said he appreciated that. They shook hands. Lydia, when Thomas told her that evening, laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that was genuinely delighted, full and ringing in the warm kitchen, and Thomas thought it was the best sound he had ever heard inside 4 walls. "He couldn't say my married name," she said. "He couldn't make himself say Mrs. Bancroft." "No," Thomas said, "he could not." "That's all right," she said. "I know what my name is." Spring came in April in the way Colorado springs come, not gradually but all at once, the snow surrendering to warm air and the creek running high and clear, and the south pasture going green overnight as if it had been waiting with impatience. Thomas added to his cattle herd with the purchase of 6 good young animals from a rancher in the next county, and the herd grew to something that required more consistent management and meant longer days and more fence maintenance, and the kind of satisfying exhaustion that comes from building something up rather than just maintaining it. Lydia's garden was an event. She had looked at his existing garden in early spring with the expression of someone assessing a project that has good bones but poor execution, and she had said nothing critical, only that she had some ideas, and by May she had expanded it to nearly twice its previous size and planted things he had never thought to plant. Beans and squash in combinations that he subsequently learned were planted together because the plants assisted each other. A row of sunflowers along the south fence, herbs near the kitchen door. The garden became something remarkable, producing through the summer with an abundance that went beyond their own needs, and allowed them to share with the Callaway family and the Marsh family, and in a gesture that Thomas admired for its quiet generosity, the Dowsett family, who were having a difficult first year on their new land. In June, Lydia told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, standing in the kitchen in the early light, and he stood very still for a moment, and then he crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her in his arms and held her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and he pressed his face against her hair, and neither of them said anything for a long moment because there wasn't a word that would have added anything to what was already there. "Are you well?" he finally said. "I'm very well," she said. "I'm more than well." "When?" "December, I think. Margaret Calloway says December. Margaret Calloway knows. Margaret has 4 children and has been watching me with the eye of experience for 2 months," Lydia said. "She figured it out before I told her. She says I have the look." "What look?" "Apparently there's a look." He pulled back and looked at her face. She was looking at him with those dark eyes and that smile that had been surprising itself for the better part of 8 months, and she was very beautiful in the morning light with the garden visible through the window behind her, and he thought that if someone had told the 22-year-old version of himself, arriving on this land with $60 and a mule, that this is what 11 years of solitude was building toward, he might have been more patient about it. "I love you," he said. It was the first time he had said it in exactly those words, and he noticed this as he said it, noted the slight delay between thinking it and saying it, as if his voice had needed a moment to confirm the scale of the thing it was carrying. She looked at him, and her eyes went soft and bright at the same time in the way he had come to recognize as the expression she wore when something landed exactly right. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you since you carried me out of that creek bed and then stood there for 3 minutes figuring out what to do next." "I was being careful," he said. "You were being yourself," she said, "which is the same thing." The summer was long and warm and full. Thomas built an addition onto the house through the July and August heat, a proper second bedroom with a window that faced west so that whoever slept there would wake to the mountains. He built the crib himself from pine boards, working in the evenings on the front porch while Lydia sat nearby reading or sewing or simply watching the sun go down. And they talked while he worked the way people talk when they have found the particular ease of being in the same room without needing to perform for each other. They talked about everything. They talked about the land and the cattle and the garden. They talked about the children Lydia was teaching, about Emmett's growing reading ability, about Pearl's extraordinary capacity for mathematics, about George, who had graduated from magic stones to what he described as a comprehensive system of protective items that now included 3 particular feathers and a piece of quartz he had found near the creek. They talked about history and about the future of the territory, and about what kind of country this was becoming and what kind they hoped it might still become. They talked about their own histories, the people they had been before they were the people they were now, and Thomas found that talking to her about his father, who had been a difficult man, and about the years before this land, which had been years of drift and uncertainty, was easier than he had expected, because she listened without trying to fix and without flinching, and because she offered her own history with equal openness, the loss of her parents, the years of work and independence, the loneliness she had carried so long she had stopped noticing its weight. "It was like this land in winter," she said one evening, "of the loneliness. After a while, you stop seeing the color that's missing because you've never seen it with color." "Yes," he said. He set down the piece of wood he had been sanding. "That's exactly right." In September, trouble arrived in the form of a man named Vance Cole. Vance Cole was a land speculator from Denver who had been moving through southeastern Colorado, buying up parcels from settlers who were struggling and reselling them to larger cattle operations that were consolidating land in the area. He had purchased 3 ranches in the previous year, all from men who had been under financial pressure, and 2 of them had left under circumstances that Thomas and several other ranchers in the area thought smelled worse than a straightforward transaction ought to. Cole rode onto Thomas's land on a September morning, while Thomas was working cattle in the south pasture, and Lydia was teaching at the Calloway place. He was a medium-sized man with expensive clothes and the smooth manner of someone who had practiced being underestimated. He introduced himself pleasantly and made Thomas a cash offer for the land that was, on its face, generous. Thomas heard the offer and looked at the man for a long, quiet moment. "Not selling," he said. "Mr. Bancroft," Cole said, with the tone of someone who has heard this response before, "this is a very fair number, better than the land office assessment." "Not selling," Thomas said again. Cole's pleasantness remained intact, but something shifted behind it like a weather change behind a clear sky. "There are a number of larger operations consolidating in this area," he said. "A small independent operation like yours will find the water rights situation increasingly difficult as those consolidations proceed." Thomas looked at him. "Is that a forecast or a plan?" he asked. Cole smiled with no warmth in it. "Just an observation," he said. "I'll observe you off my land," Thomas said. "Same direction you came from." Cole left. He left with his pleasantness intact, which Thomas found more troubling than if he had left angry, because men who keep their pleasantness when they don't get what they want are more dangerous than men who lose their tempers. Thomas rode to the Calloway place to tell Lydia when she was done teaching. She listened to the whole account with her arms folded, and the focused expression she wore when she was processing something serious. "He's doing to you what he did to the Hargreave family and the Moss family," she said. "The pressure about water rights first, then something more direct." "That's my reading," Thomas said. "Is there anything he can actually do about the water rights? The creek that runs through this land runs through 2 other properties before it reaches me. If someone upstream diverts, who's upstream? The land directly upstream sold to a Denver cattle operation 8 months ago," he said. "I assumed that was coincidence." "Maybe it wasn't," she said. They rode to speak with Frank Calloway and his neighbor James Marsh that evening, because both their properties also depended on creek water for livestock, and both were in areas Cole had been circling. The 4 of them sat in the Calloway kitchen and talked through what they knew and what it added up to. "He's trying to dry us out," Frank Calloway said, "literally. Or convince us he will so we sell before he has to," James Marsh said. "Either way, the same result." "We file the water rights claim before he can move," Lydia said. Everyone at the table looked at her. "The Territorial Water Rights Office in Pueblo. If we file a formal claim to the water rights of the creek as a collective, as all the properties it runs through, it establishes prior use and makes any diversion legally contestable. I know because my father had a similar situation in a Missouri River dispute when I was 12 and he won it that way." "Do you know how to file that claim?" Thomas asked. "I know the general shape of it," she said. "I'd need to go to Pueblo and talk to the land office. I can take the stage next week." "I'll go with you," Thomas said. "You have calves coming," she said. "Stay with the cattle. I can do this." He looked at her across the table. She looked back at him with the same steady certainty she had been looking at him with since the first time she had sat in his kitchen with the quilt around her shoulders, and he believed her completely. "All right," he said. She went to Pueblo on the Tuesday stage and was back by Thursday with the paperwork begun, and the claim filed in the names of the Bancroft, Calloway, and Marsh properties as co-holders of historical water rights to the creek. The Territorial Land Office had been skeptical initially, but Lydia had been thorough and patient, and had quoted relevant statutes from memory, which had impressed the clerk considerably. Vance Cole, when he learned of the filing through whatever network of information men like him maintain, did not come back to Thomas's land. He moved his operations north. The Calloway and Marsh families received no more visits from men in expensive clothes. The creek ran clear through the fall. "You did that," Thomas said when they knew the threat had passed. "We did that," she said. "Frank and James signed the paperwork. You thought of it." "My father thought of it first," she said. "I just had a good memory." He took her hand. She squeezed it. Outside the window, the October land was going gold and red, and the mountains were already white on the high peaks, and it was exactly the same as it had been every October for 11 years, except that it was nothing like any of them had been. The baby came in December, a few days before Christmas. in a hard winter storm that trapped the traveling doctor from Hartwell on the wrong side of a drifted road, and meant that the birth happened with Margaret Calloway in attendance, who had delivered 3 of her own 4 children without significant medical assistance, and who approached the situation with the calm authority of someone who has done difficult things before and knows that difficulty and impossibility are not the same. Margaret Calloway was remarkable. Thomas spent the hours of the labor trying to be useful, and being told by Margaret to stop hovering and put more wood on the stove and boil more water, which he did, repeatedly, until the house was very warm and there was more boiled water than any birth had ever required in the history of Colorado Territory. And then, at just past midnight on a December night, with the snow coming down outside, and the mountains invisible in the dark, and the house holding all its warmth against the cold, his son was born. A son, a boy with dark hair and a furious cry and hands that were already, incredibly, the hands of a person. Thomas held him in the first minutes of his life, standing by the stove with this small, impossible weight in his arms, and looked down at this new person who was somehow made of both him and Lydia, and yet was entirely and already himself, and felt something that had no name in any language he had ever spoken, something large and uncontainable and very quiet at the center of it. "He's perfect," Lydia said from the bed, pale and exhausted and with her eyes very bright. "He is," Thomas said. He brought the boy to her and she gathered him in, and the 3 of them were in the lamplight together while the snow fell outside and Margaret Calloway discreetly made herself useful with laundry and the stove. "What do we name him?" Lydia asked. "I was thinking William," Thomas said. "My grandfather's name, he was a good man." "William," Lydia said, looking at the small face. "William Bancroft." She looked up at Thomas. "Yes, that's right." William Bancroft came into the world on a December night in 1874 in a stone and timber house in southeastern Colorado Territory, and he came into it already loved with a completeness that left no room for qualification. Christmas that year was spent in the company of the Calloway family, who came 2 days after the birth when the snow had eased and the road was passable, and the Marsh family, and Emmett, Pearl, and George Alderman, who had asked and been granted permission to visit the new baby. George Alderman arrived with his piece of quartz in his pocket and spent considerable time explaining to the sleeping William the protective system and how it worked, and then placed the quartz briefly against the baby's forehead before putting it back in his own pocket, explaining that the transfer was complete. "George," Lydia said, "that is one of the kindest things anyone has ever done for us." George nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose expertise has been appropriately recognized. The winter passed and the spring came, and the year 1875 opened itself like a new chapter of something that had been building for a long time. William grew with the particular determination of children who have decided to become people as quickly as possible. He was a serious baby who observed everything around him with dark eyes that were indisputably Lydia's and an expression of deep consideration that was indisputably Thomas's. And he had a laugh that, when it came, was so complete and delighted that it made everyone in the room laugh back. Thomas's cattle herd grew to a size that required a second hand, and he hired a young man from Hartwell named Reuben Torres, who was 18 years old and had grown up on a small Mexican land-grant family ranch that had been lost to the same kind of consolidation pressure Thomas had fought off. Reuben was a natural with cattle and learned the land's character quickly, and was quiet in the particular way of people who listen more than they speak, and he became over the following months a genuine part of the rhythm of the place, eating supper at the house 2 or 3 nights a week and showing William, when William was old enough to be interested, how to approach a horse correctly and how to tell the weather by the way the cattle were standing. The schoolroom at the Calloway place expanded. Lydia had applied to the Territorial School Authority in early 1875 for recognition as a proper school and a modest stipend to go with it, and had argued her case in writing with such thoroughness that the authority had agreed by summer. The school received 3 new books and a proper globe, and a small amount of money for supplies. 2 more children enrolled from families that had settled east of the marsh property. Lydia taught 6 days a week during the school months and spent the other time on the land, in the garden, with William, and in the long evenings that had become the best part of Thomas's days. She had gotten into the habit of reading aloud in the evenings. She would sit by the stove with William on her lap or sleeping in the cradle nearby and read, history or fiction or occasionally the newspaper. And Thomas would be working at something nearby, mending leather or sharpening tools or simply sitting, and the sound of her voice and the words she chose and the way she commented on what she was reading, a small observation here or there, a question, a point of disagreement with the author, had become the texture of his evenings in the same fundamental way that the sound of the wind or the creek had been the texture of his evenings before her. He thought about this sometimes, the way she had redefined his experience of the ordinary. Not the large moments, though there had been large moments. The wedding, the birth of his son, the water rights fight, the moment on the rock shelf in October of '73. But the ordinary ones, the morning coffee and the evening reading, the way she laughed at things he found funny in exactly the same moment he found them funny, the way she argued with him, always directly and always fairly and always as if his intelligence was the assumed minimum rather than the thing being evaluated. The way she touched his arm when she walked past him in the kitchen, not for emphasis, just for contact, the unself-conscious physical closeness of someone who has become native to the space around another person. He had lived alone for 11 years and called it peace, and he had believed that name. He had genuinely believed it. The land and the solitude and the work and the silence, he had called all of it peace, and it had not felt like a lie because he had never known the alternative. You cannot grieve the color that has been absent from your sky since before you were old enough to name colors. You simply don't know that the sky could be different. She had arrived with a head wound and a carpetbag and an argument to have with a difficult man, and she had shown him the difference between the silence he had been living in and the peace that was possible when silence was full of someone else's breathing. In the spring of 1876, Lydia told him there would be a second child. She told him in the garden in early April with the first green things coming up, and William, now 16 months old, sitting in the dirt nearby trying to put soil in his mouth with great concentration, and Thomas sat down on the garden wall and pulled her down beside him and kissed her properly before he said anything else. "Again," he said, against her temple. "Again," she said, and she was laughing. "When? October, probably. October," he said. He looked at William, who had succeeded in getting soil in his mouth and was reconsidering the decision. William's going to be interested in this. He won't understand it for a while. "No," Thomas said, "but he'll be interested." He put his arm around her, and they sat in the April garden with the mountains still snow-capped to the west, and the land warm and willing under them, and William in the dirt making the small, serious sounds of a child engaged in science. "Are you happy?" she asked, in the particular way she occasionally asked it, directly and quietly, meaning something more specific than the general word, meaning are you happy with this, with us, with the shape our life has taken, with the choice we made? "Lydia," he said, he pressed his lips to her hair. "I built this house when I was 22 years old and I lived in it alone for 11 years and I called it peace. And then you fell in my creek." He paused. "I have been happy every day since September of '73. I don't mean that everything has been easy. I mean that happy and easy aren't the same thing. I mean that I get up every morning and the first thing I see is this land and the second thing I see or hear is you, and those two things together are the sum of everything I didn't know I was building toward." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is the most words you have said at once since the water rights filing." He laughed. It was a full laugh, the kind that happened when something landed exactly right, and she laughed with him, and William looked up from his soil experiment and laughed because the other people were laughing, which is one of the truest things a small child does. The second baby arrived in October 1876, at a much more convenient hour and with the actual doctor present, who showed up with time to spare and delivered a girl with no complications and an immediate and vocal opinion about her situation. She had Thomas's gray eyes and Lydia's dark hair, and she came into the world with the same completeness as her brother, though her completeness expressed itself immediately as sound rather than silence. They named her Clara, which was both for Lydia's mother and for the clear October sky on the day she arrived. William, who was almost 2, came to the bedside and looked at his sister with the expression of someone encountering a force of nature and trying to determine its disposition. He studied her for a long time and then looked up at Thomas and said loud with great seriousness, and Thomas agreed that yes, she was loud, and William seemed to find this an acceptable conclusion to the question. Thomas held Clara the way he had held William on his first night, by the stove, in the lamplight, with the mountains somewhere in the dark beyond the window. He held her and looked down at her face, which was furious and new and already itself, and felt again that nameless feeling that was large and uncontainable and very quiet at the center. Lydia watched him from the bed with the doctor packing up his bag in the corner, and the lamp burning warm and the house settled around all of them like something that knows what it is. "Thomas," she said. "Yes. Bring her here." He brought her and settled them together and sat on the edge of the bed beside them and looked at his wife and his daughter in the lamplight. And outside the window the October land was dark and cold and enormous and utterly indifferent to any individual life, as it had always been, as it would always be, and yet within the circle of that lamp, on this land in this house. The indifference of the world felt not like a threat but like a backdrop against which everything that mattered stood out very clearly. Life settled into itself the way things do when they have found their proper shape. The ranch grew steadily. Reuben Torres became not just a hired hand but what Thomas thought of as a second son to the land, learning every acre of it with the devotion of someone who had lost his own land and was determined never to lose his relationship with land again. He was good with William and patient with Clara, and had a talent for fixing things that saved Thomas significant money and effort over the years. The school at the Callaway place continued to grow. By 1877, there were 14 children enrolled, and Lydia was working to secure a proper schoolhouse building, which the Territorial School Authority had promised funding for if the community could provide the land and the labor. The community could and did. Thomas donated the labor of himself and Reuben and 2 weeks of autumn time. Frank Callaway and James Marsh and 3 other neighboring men contributed labor and materials. The Hartwell School, a single room with 6 windows and a proper wood stove and bookshelves built into the south wall, was completed in October of 1877, and Lydia Hayes Bancroft was its first, and for some years its only teacher. On the day the school opened, George Alderman, who was now 9 years old and who had developed from a magic stone-carrying 5-year-old into a deeply curious, broadly knowledgeable boy who could identify 20 species of native birds and had recently demonstrated an ability to do long division in his head, placed a small stone on the corner of Lydia's desk on the first morning. "It's a new one," he said, "for the new place." "George," Lydia said, "I will keep it always." He nodded. It was complete. Josiah Alderman died in the spring of 1878, unexpectedly, of a heart that had been carrying more weight than anyone had known. He died having been a difficult man and a complicated father and someone who had, in his last years, made what peace he was capable of making with having been wrong about a few important things. His 3 children were taken in by Clara Alderman's sister and her husband in Pueblo, which was a better situation than anyone who knew the details would have predicted. Emmett, Pearl, and George left in late spring, and on the day they left, all 3 of them came to say goodbye to Lydia. George gave her a 4th stone. He did not explain the system. He simply placed it in her hand and closed her fingers around it, and she held it tight and did not cry until they were gone. The land changed around them in the ways that land changes in territorial Colorado in the late 1870s. more settlers arriving, more towns establishing themselves, the railroad pushing closer from the north and east, the world shrinking the way it always does when better transportation arrives. The Ute removal that Thomas and Lydia had both feared came in 1880, a dark and shameful thing done with the efficiency of a government that understood how to displace people without calling it what it was. And Thomas and Lydia talked about it with the sorrow and anger it deserved. And Lydia taught her students its true shape. And she kept the history honest on the schoolroom wall with a map that showed the shrinking boundaries of the Ute lands decade by decade. Because she believed, as her father had believed, that the job of a teacher was to tell the truth of the world as clearly as the world could bear it. In 1879, their third child was born, another boy. They named him James, for James Marsh, who had been a good neighbor and a good man, and who had recently died of pneumonia, leaving his wife and children in difficult circumstances that the whole community had quietly organized around, the way communities do when they are more than just neighbors and have decided to be something more like family. James Bancroft was a different child from his brother and sister, easier from the beginning, sunnier, with a laugh that arrived more readily and a face that expressed itself more completely. He had a gift for making people feel seen that was evident from very young, the way he looked at you when you spoke to him, with the full weight of his attention, which was a gift that Thomas recognized as coming from Lydia in its texture, though its expression was entirely James's own. William, who was 5 when James was born, took his role as eldest brother with great seriousness. He was a quiet, thoughtful boy who had Thomas's directness and Lydia's intellectual intensity, and who was already, at 5, reading fluently from books well beyond his age, which pleased his mother and slightly amazed his father. Clara, at 3, was everything the land required of someone born to it: loud, energetic, fearless, with an absolute refusal to be left behind in anything her brother was doing, and a gift for negotiation that was both exhausting and impressive. The house had been expanded twice by this point. The second expansion Thomas had built with Reuben's help in the spring of 1877, adding a proper dining room and 2 more bedrooms upstairs. The stone and timber structure he had built board by board at 22 was now a house that held a family and a life, and the specific, irreplaceable warmth of a place where people are genuinely happy. In the evenings, Thomas still sat in the main room while Lydia read aloud, but now there were small people nearby, William with a book of his own, Clara with a collection of rocks that she was organizing by size, James on his father's knee or his mother's knee, or on the rug making towers from wooden blocks and knocking them down with enormous satisfaction. The room was never quiet the way it had been before. It was full in the way that some rooms are full, not with noise exactly but with life, the specific frequency of people who belong to each other occupying the same space. Thomas looked at it sometimes the way he had looked at the kitchen the first night Lydia cleaned it, with a kind of bewildered gratitude, with the feeling of someone who has been given something larger than what they asked for and is still adjusting to the scale of it. He said this to Lydia one evening in the summer of 1880, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet and they were sitting on the front porch in the warm night with the stars overhead and the mountains dark against the sky and the cricket sound everywhere. "I want to say something," he said. "All right," she said. "I think about who I was before you," he said. "I don't mean it as a sad thing. I think about it to understand the difference. I was a man who had built something real and good, and I knew the value of it, and I was fine. I was fine every day, competent and solitary and fine." She was looking at him in the dark. "And now I'm not fine," he said. "I'm something else. I'm full, the way this house is full, the way the land is full in spring. I'm not fine. I'm something much larger than fine, and I want you to know that I know the difference and I know what made it." She was quiet for a moment in the warm dark. Then she said, "You carried me out of that creek." "You fell in my creek," he said. "I fell in your creek," she said. "I was on my way somewhere else entirely and I fell in your creek and you picked me up. "The practical thing to do," he said. She laughed. "The very practical thing to do." He took her hand in the dark. She turned her palm up and laced her fingers through his. "Thomas," she said, "I want to tell you something too." "Tell me." "I was going to a difficult job in a difficult household, and I had lost everything that was mine, and I was carrying it all by myself the way I had been carrying everything by myself for 2 years. And then there was a storm and a creek and a man who carried me in without being asked and put the axle grease in a better place, and had the patience to answer my questions and the honesty to ask his own." She paused. "I have been, since the moment I woke up in your spare room on my way home. I just didn't know it at first. I thought I was passing through. I thought you were a coincidence, but I was always going to end up here. I was always going to be here," he said. "I just didn't know I was waiting." She put her head on his shoulder. He put his arm around her. Above them the summer sky went on forever in the way of Colorado sky, more stars than seem possible, more dark between them, more space than the mind can comfortably hold, and the land around them was utterly still, and the creek was a silver thread in the moonlight, and the mountains were a great dark patience on the western horizon. The silence of the land that had been peace for 11 years was here again, exactly as it always was, but it was different now. It was full. It was held by 2 people and 3 sleeping children and a hired hand asleep in the bunkhouse and a cattle herd in the south pasture, and a schoolhouse 4 miles north with 14 students' drawings pinned to the walls and a small stone on the corner of the teacher's desk. The silence was not empty. It had never been going to be empty. It had been waiting for its content. Here was its content. Here was the shape that all that silence had been keeping for. The man who had built this place, and the woman who had arrived like weather and become like weather and made of it something he had not had the language to call what it actually was. He had called it peace. She had arrived and he understood it had been silence. Now it was both. Now it was everything. The years that followed ran in the way of good years, with difficulty woven through them the way difficulty is always woven through the fabric of a life lived fully, but with a tensile strength that held. William Bancroft grew into a serious, lanky young man with his mother's mind and his father's hands. And by the time he was 12, he was working the land alongside Thomas and Reuben, with the skill and dedication of someone who understood that this place was his inheritance and intended to deserve it. Clara grew into a force of nature who could ride a horse better than most men in the county and had, by 13, decided that she was going to become a doctor, an ambition that her mother greeted with immediate practical support, and her father greeted with the same look he had given Lydia when she told him she would handle the water rights filing, which was the look of a man who believes the person in front of him completely. James grew into his gift for people, and became the one who knew everyone and was known by everyone, and who moved through the world with a warmth that was its own kind of competence. Reuben Torres, in 1882, met a young woman named Sophia at the Hartwell Church social, and courted her with a steadiness and a genuineness that Thomas recognized, and married her in the spring of 1883. Thomas and Lydia gave them the use of the small house Thomas had built at the north end of the property in 1878, and Sophia Torres planted her own garden next to it, and became Lydia's closest friend in the territory and a third teacher at the Hartwell School, when the enrollment grew to the point that Lydia could no longer manage it alone. Life moved. The territory became the state of Colorado in 1876, and the world moved with it, changing and growing and becoming something different from what it had been. The railroad arrived closer. The towns grew. The character of the frontier shifted from wild to something more settled. Though settled and peaceful were still not always the same word, and anyone honest about the history of this country understood that the settlement had been built on a violence that deserved to be named and remembered. And Lydia made sure her students understood this, year after year, with the maps and the books and the honest teaching that her father had modeled for her, and that she had promised herself she would carry forward. In the autumn of 1884, on a day that Thomas would mark for the rest of his life. He and Lydia rode up to the rock shelf above the north pasture, the first time they had done it since that October day in 1873, when he had kissed her for the first time, and the whole territory had spread before them. They rode up in the early afternoon and tied the horses and stood at the edge of the rock shelf and looked out at the 40 miles of country and the mountains and the sky. William was 14 and home with the younger two. The land below them showed the marks of 12 years of building, the house larger and well-kept, the barn sound and solid, the garden still extraordinary, the cattle herd visible in the south pasture as small dark shapes against the yellowed autumn grass. 12 years, Lydia said. 11 since the wedding, he said, but 12 since you fell in my creek. 12 years since I fell in your creek, she said. I've been thinking about it this morning, about who I was that morning. Sitting in your kitchen with a quilt around my shoulders figuring out whether you were a threat. I kept very still, he said. Seemed like the right approach. It was exactly the right approach, she said. They stood side by side on the rock shelf with the wind in the grass and the hawks riding their thermals below them, which was exactly as it had been, and looked at the world that had happened in the 12 years since she arrived. I want to tell you something, he said. He had been building to this all morning and had not found the right words until now. Tell me, she said. I had a good life here before you, he said. I want to be clear about that. It was good. It was mine and I had built it and I valued it. But he stopped and looked at the mountains, which were very close and very clear in the October air. But I understand now that I was living in it the way you live in a house that's well built but empty. All the structure is right. All the walls are right, but there's no one in the rooms. She was looking at him. You came in, he said, and you put things in the rooms. The axle grease in the right place and the coffee in the right place and your voice in the evening and your reading aloud and the children and the school and the water rights and the magic stones. He stopped. You put everything in the rooms and now the house makes sense for the first time. She looked at him for a long moment and then she said, Thomas Bancroft, that is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me. I've been saving it, he said. She laughed, full and complete in the way she always laughed, and he laughed with her, and then she put her arms around him and he put his arms around her, and they stood on the rock shelf in the October light with the whole territory before them and the mountains behind, and the world going about its enormous, indifferent business all around them. I love you, she said, against his shoulder. I love you, he said. I have loved you since you sat in my kitchen and told me that good conditions for learning are non-negotiable. I said that to aldermen. I know. I heard it secondhand from Cora Tanner. I was in love with you before I went to the Alderman Ranch. I was in love with you and I was pretending I needed salt. She pulled back and looked at him. You didn't need salt. I had plenty of salt, he said. She shook her head, but she was smiling, that full, genuine smile that had been surprising itself for 12 years and still looked slightly surprised every time. 11 years of solitude and you sneak into town for fake salt. It seemed like a practical cover, he said. They rode back down in the late afternoon, back to the house and the children and the supper that needed making and the cattle that needed checking and the ordinary, essential, irreplaceable life that had been built on this land by a man who had been alone long enough to understand the value of what he had been given, and a woman who had arrived with nothing and found everything. Thomas Bancroft rode into his yard in the October light and looked at his house with its warm windows and the smoke rising from the chimney, and heard through the open door Clara's voice and William's voice, and the small sound of James dropping something and then laughing about it. And behind all of that the sound of Lydia's voice speaking to one of them in the calm, engaged, fully present tone that she used with children when they needed to feel heard. He sat in the saddle for one moment and listened to it. The land around him was as it had always been. The same red earth and the same creek and the same mountains and the same enormous sky. The same silence underneath everything that he had learned a long time ago was not the silence of emptiness but the silence of patience, the silence of land that has been waiting for what it was waiting for. It had been waiting for this. for the sound of her voice through the window and the smoke from the chimney and the 3 children inside and the man in the yard who had finally understood what all those years of solitude had been building toward. Not peace, not emptiness. Just the accumulation of a life ready to be filled. He dismounted and led the horse to the barn and fed and watered him and came back across the yard and pushed open the door and went inside. And the warmth of the house and the smell of supper and the voices of his children and the look on his wife's face when she turned and saw him come through the door hit him all at once. The way the color of a thing hits you when you have been long in the dark. It hit him and he let it. "You're back," Lydia said. "I'm back," he said. He hung his hat on the peg by the door. He crossed the kitchen. He kissed her briefly, because the children were present, and Clara was already making the noise she made when her parents were being embarrassing. He put his hand on her back for a moment, that gesture of simple, uncomplicated contact that meant I am here and you are here and the world is exactly the right size. She put her hand over his for a moment. "Come and eat," she said. "It's ready." He sat at the table. His children sat at the table. His wife sat at the table and passed the beans and spoke to William about the history lesson. She was planning for the week and told Clara that the stone she had brought in from the yard needed to stay outside, and told James to stop trying to feed his supper to the dog under the table. And all of it, every ordinary word of it, filled the room the way warm air fills a cold space, thoroughly and without drama, until there was no room left for anything else. Outside the window, the October land went dark and the mountains disappeared into the evening, and the creek ran its cold, clear run, and the sky filled up with stars, and the silence of the land was exactly what it had always been. But the house was full, and the man who had built it board by board at 22 and lived in its silence for 11 years and called it peace looked around at everything that silence had been waiting to become, and understood, as he had understood every day for 12 years, that what he had called peace had only been the world holding its breath until she arrived. And now the world was breathing, and so was he, and it was everything.